Hey everybody, welcome to another little Blender grease pencil tutorial. This time I wanted to talk about some of the real-time compositor features that you can use in Blender now. I'm in Blender 5.0, but I believe that the real-time compositor has been functional in some sense since at least like 4.2, maybe 4.5. You know, the original reason that I learned Blender was because I was so stoked on the 2D animation tool in grease pencil. The first really popular Blender tutorial I ever posted on YouTube was my beginner grease pencil tutorial, which is rather outdated in my opinion at this point. A lot of things about grease pencil have changed since then, and a lot of things about Blender in general have changed, including what you can do with the compositor in real time. One of the strengths of grease pencil, in my opinion, is that it's just really fun and fluid to work with in real time. It gives you kind of a security in what you're drawing that nothing is so rasterized to the point that you can't like edit it, or you can't kind of treat something in some way, whether through the compositor or through just editing and sculpting the stroke or applying textures to the stroke in some way. It's a very like fluid tool. And so that's one of my favorite things about it and why it's so fun to work with in real time. But one of the big drawbacks for me when I first got into it is that it always kind of had like a pretty flat look that you had to do a lot of battling to get it to feel more organic and lend itself more towards practical 2D animation. And ultimately, I don't think anything is ever going to come close to like, oh, just, you know, get a watercolor brush and some paper and just start doing it by hand, frame by frame. I think there's a real beauty to traditional animation that we're never really going to fully capture through these kinds of digital tools. But I think anything that we can do to kind of imitate them and lend our work more towards the traditional aesthetics, I think can make it really fun just to work with these digital tools in general. And if nothing else, it's just a really fun experiment to see what you can do with Blender now. So I'm going to break these effects down and talk about some of the inspirations, like my thought process in building these effects, ways that you can kind of push them and modulate them yourselves, and the basic like node tree setup so that you could get right into Blender and start building this effect for yourself. But if you'd rather save yourself some time and support me, you can go get the file over on my Patreon right now. For anybody in the $1 and up tier, it's, you know, does a lot to have, you know, a lot of folks supporting me over there. So I really appreciate everybody supporting the Patreon, but you should be able to get to somewhere pretty close to what I have with these templates just by following along in the tutorial. So without further ado, let's get into it. I just want to start by talking about some of the inspirations for these aesthetics. One of which being my friend Milky T Studios. Their work, so cool. She's a really amazing artist. And she has this really like fuzzy illustration style, which I'll pull up to share with you guys. I want to share one of my favorite pieces. This illustration in particular has been a big inspiration for me. This like fuzzy kind of shading around the character, a little like drop shadow stuff. The blurry kind of fades of color. Like, I really love the way that Senna works digitally to push her illustrations into a more traditional feeling. Something about just giving it that like fuzzy edge makes it feel very organic. And so I wanted to emulate that through grease pencil using Blender's compositor. Another artist that's been a huge inspiration for this style is Plastaboo. I really love, you can see a bit of that like fuzziness around the illustration of the character, but even just like the little bits of grain and texture on all of these elements in the illustration, it does a lot to push it into a really organic, traditional feeling. Oh, another huge one, actually. We got to talk about Sunny Limbs. So this artist is another really huge inspiration for the style, namely in this sort of crayon traditional animation. I love the way that they create this like blur, and I don't know if they're doing too much compositing, like digital stuff to shift the blur around, but this, oh man, this one is just really phenomenal. Like all the texture and grit that comes through with this, it makes it feel, I mean, one, I'm pretty sure this absolutely is traditional animation, but it looks so alive and captivating to have that little bit of grit on those. It just feels so alive and captivating to have all that paper texture that comes through from the crayon, laying out the colors and the little fading of color between this like brown and yellow. Really great work. I love this animator a lot. I really recommend you go check them out. They have really great digital animation as well. I love the way they use color. So they're a huge inspiration in developing some of these styles. One other guy, this artist, James Noel Ert, also really amazing animator, also uses 3D in their work. So they were a really big inspiration as far as the way that they use the compositor. Actually, I think they have a bit where they talk about on it on YouTube. This video was probably the a bit of an inciting incident for me when I saw this video from James, breaking down kind of the way that they built this scene in the compositor, using it to treat the lights and shadows and the little bit of fuzz that they add. You can, like, if you look closely at some of these edges of characters, you can see that the compositor is just adding a little bit of fuzz around the edges, and it does so much to bring this like 3D style into something that feels a little bit more like a painted cell from like a traditional animation. I really love this piece as well. They have some of their like style breakdown where James shows their technique in painting directly onto models like in Procreate and then bringing it back into Blender to animate, and it just does so much for the animation and the style. It's so cool. But that's enough of talking about some of the inspirations for the styles. Time to actually like show you guys how the compositor works. Before I break down kind of my thought process when working with these effects, I figured I would just start from like a blank Blender file and show you guys how I set it up. So I'm gonna just split my viewport here so we can have the compositor on the left here. That's the text editor. Let me just kind of subdivide this cube so that we have something more colorful to look at here. So we're gonna start by adding a new compositor node tree, and I'm gonna start by let's just start with adding a noise texture node, and then we're going to add a displace node. Now we're going to run our image through the displace, and from this point, you'll want to make sure that you have compositor on always enabled. That way you'll be able to see any updates over here directly in the viewport. So you can see as we move this image around, we get some displacement in our viewport as well. So we're going to run our noise texture into a vector math add node and subtract by 0.5. And this is just going to normalize our noise texture from this to this. So we're going to get some negative values, which is going to allow us to shift the image, in sort of unilateral directions from where the original pixel is going to be. And at this point, we're going to want to control the intensity of this displacement. So we're going to add a multiply node so you can see we can kind of get more intense displacement. And then we're just going to run that into our displace node. And then if we multiply this, you can see we start to get some warbliness. Now, I think for a regular kind of like paper texture, you kind of want a higher scale noise texture. And I think something like that is honestly getting us to a pretty good spot. Maybe tune it into like 50 pixels of displacement. And yeah, that gives us some nice rough edges. I think even this is already a really great start to the effect, but there's a lot more that I've kind of messed around with to get it feeling a little bit more paper-like. And the first thing we're going to do is just add a Kuwahara node. So by adding this Kuwahara in line, you can see that as I increase the radius of the Kuwahara filter, we get a little bit less noisiness around the edges. And if I lower the eccentricity, we get even more of an effect. Versus if I raise the eccentricity, we should see a little bit more noisiness. If I lower this value down to like 6. And then this sharpness value also allows us to kind of create a little bit more blur around the edges of the colors. I think maybe something like this gives us a pretty nice effect. I personally like a little bit more sharpness, having a little bit more refined edges to the colors. Let's actually switch this to an emission color so that we're not too distracted with the shading. And then I'll just duplicate this and add a little bit different of a color so we can see how it blends. So between the noise texture displacement and the Kuwahara node, we can start to get some pretty unique effects. You can see as I raise the displacement multiplier on our noise texture, we start to get like more fuzzy edges. It starts to look maybe a little bit more watercolor-ish, especially if we lower the scale of the noise texture a bit. Starts to be a very interesting effect there. But let's tune it in a bit so it's not too extreme. Raise the texture again. So now I think what is really the cherry on top to this effect of really selling the look of the kind of traditional paper animation style is if we add a image node. So I have a little folder of texture assets here. Let me go to this one. So I'm just going to grab this paper texture that I have here, drag it in, and then we're going to run this through a soft light color mix node, plug this in here. And then you'll see that we can kind of start to get like a paper texture that's overlaid in the viewport, maybe this amount of effectiveness. So if we look close at the colors, you can see that little bit of irregularity in the color that I think looks really nice. This might be less distracting if I turn on transparent, so we're only seeing the texture on the spots with an alpha mask. And then it's not necessarily coming through on this one. Let me change the color here. Yeah, we can see it a bit. So you'll notice that the texture actually flows pretty seamlessly from one color to another. But I think an effect that I really like that I think could look nice in making this not look so flat, as if the texture is just kind of like flatly pasted over the objects, is if we add a little bit of displacement to this image, and we'll base that displacement off of the hue of the original. So I'm going to separate the color of our original image, switch it to HSV, and then just take this hue value, and then let's use a regular math node to subtract by 0.5. I accidentally grabbed a vector math, but that's fine. And then we'll multiply it to change the intensity of the displacement. And so if you look, as I am shifting the intensity of the displacement, the direction that it's moving in is relative to the hue of the object. So if we actually grab this object and start shifting the hue value around a bit, you'll see that the image texture is going to kind of move with it as well, though it's not. Actually, it's not moving at all right now. That's kind of irregular. I guess like it wasn't a very high scale offset, so it wasn't. Yeah, you can see if I scale up the intensity of the displacement, it's pretty clear that it's like moving around a bit, which I think looks pretty cool. I'm just going to raise that. And then another thing that I do in my node trees with this that is a little bit more advanced is I'm mixing the displacement with a noise texture, add in a linear light blending color mix, and then plug in this noise texture right here. And then if we kind of change, I think we want to keep the scale pretty low, and then we'll add a multiplier here so that the noise texture has a little bit more intense of an effect. You can see now our image, if I just output specifically from maybe, yeah, here, you can see that the noise texture is kind of shifting our image around a bit. So by keeping the scale pretty small and then increasing the displacement a bit, we can kind of like break up that uniformity even more, which I think can have a pretty nice effect. And this is a thing that you'll want to play with and kind of find your own preference for it. But at this point, you can see we're now entering one of the kind of first problems of pushing these kind of displaced nodes really far, is that we're starting to get this black boxing where the edges of our image are getting pushed into the frame. And there's not really like, you can't manage the UVs of an image node in the compositor the way you would with like a shader node that's loading an image texture. But what we can do is add a vector math node to run immediately after. Oh my gosh, why is it? Oh, this is like a bug. That's not even my computer lagging. That was so strange. But yeah, we're going to add a vector math node, and then we're going to set it to wrap and run it immediately after our linear light mode. And I'm going to set this max value to like 480, and then we'll do negative 480 for the min. And then that gets us to a point that it doesn't really matter, you know, even if we add like an add node right before here, it doesn't matter how much we push the image, it's always going to end up wrapping back to negative 480 as soon as it hits positive 480. So we can really go crazy with the intensity of our displacements, though we do introduce these kinds of wonky seams and stuff, though that's not as much of a problem by the time we actually mix the texture in with the soft light. But yeah, that's the basic idea of this node tree. We're just using a noise texture to displace, and then we're running it through a Kuwahara filter to denoise it a bit. And then we're using this soft light color mixer to blend in this paper texture that we load in, which we also displace based on the hue of our object mixed with some noise to get to a point that we have some really intense displacement to make it look really nice and irregular, until finally we have the final output from the soft light node. As for the templates that I've set up in my project file that you can get on the Patreon, I've done a lot of like pretty tiny changes to this basic node tree. If you follow along, you'll probably be able to replicate all of these. But the main thing is in this like displacement. This is like really where kind of like the displacement and the Kuwahara node work together to create some really dynamic effects over the course of all these different little experiments that I've done with these in these template scenes that I've set up that you can go get on the Patreon. I've kind of tried to construct them into these node groups so that we can have a clean breakdown of exactly what's going on here. So if I just start by viewing this, you can see that the base output of this grease pencil scene, it's, you know, this really basic illustration, you know, just some basic like colors and lines laid out. But once we run it through this like watercolor displacement, you can see I have a few different parameters here that I'm messing with, and we'll go into the larger node tree, but just to show you kind of what is immediately accessible here, this main intensity controls the displacement of this larger noise texture, which I'll find, I believe it's this one, is this sort of fuzzy but not too grainy noise texture. This one is like our first displacement pass that is fundamentally just shifting the larger blobs of color around, and we can control the scale of it here. You can see we get like more warbly displacement where there's not too much irregularity, but then as you increase the scale, you can see that we get a bit more like jaggedy edges similar to like watercolor. And then we have this paper grit intensity, as I've named it here. This was added to give it a more fuzzy edge after the initial warble to kind of make the edges feel more like they're bleeding into grains on paper. These other parameters that I've set up, you can see if I play the animation, it's displacing the edge a little bit. I wanted to give it some sense of maybe being drawn multiple times. It doesn't necessarily, this is just one drawing that I've made, but if you were adding animation, having that irregularity of the edges shifting around a little bit would do a lot to make it look like you were drawing on multiple pieces of paper and then stacking them in the frame by frame animation. And so then after this initial displacement, which I believe this effect is already doing a lot to make this feel a lot more organic. And I think it comes through a lot when you actually grab one of these grease pencil objects and start drawing in real time. If I set my brush stroke settings, you can see that even as I'm drawing in real time, like laying strokes, it immediately is realizing that grit and texture. And it starts to feel a lot like drawing with a more refined brush like in Procreate, which I really enjoy the effect of this. It makes it makes it immediately feel really fun to doodle around in. And another thing that is happening here, which you'll notice if I switch over to this black material, you can see that the black is not being as displaced as if I switch to like a white color. You can see the white is being displaced quite a bit more. And that's because I'm using this this color ramp to change, like basically multiply the intensity of the displacement based on the brightness of the colors being passed in. So you can see if I kind of just delete these, if I delete the black, you can see that it's basically treating all of it as like, okay, none of this should be getting displaced. But if I lower it to black, you can see we're basically controlling the intensity based on the value of the colors. And I think that's important to me for this tree, because I want to make sure that if I'm laying in these like really dark details with black, I don't want that getting like distorted too much. Like if I'm drawing a face of a character where it's just like black eyes and like a mouth, I want to control that and keep that less distorted. Now you could probably get a similar effect by having like composited layers, where for the details that you don't want getting like fuzzed too much or displaced around, you could have those on one render layer and then just stack them on the next. I'm not sure exactly how far you could go with within one scene setting up all those different render layers, but if you have your basic animation and then you have two different objects, you could duplicate the scene, bring those in as separate render layers, and then basically change which objects are visible in each different render layer that you're compositing together. So I mean, I don't feel like setting all that up to explain better, but it's just sort of like theorizing like why I have this particular color ramp control and like other ways that you could go about it if you don't necessarily want to control things just based on color. But for me, it's really just I wanted to retain the structure of these like darker colors in the scene. To really lend itself to this watercolor look that I'm going for, I have this last linear light color mix, which I'm mixing with this noise texture, which is fully just there to add some intensity, irregularity to the color, like the strokes of color. I run it through this color ramp to increase the contrast a little bit, where I can have strict control of just how dark or how light these larger swatches of color become. And then after being mixed with the linear light node, you can see we start to get a really nice just a regularity of value where it doesn't necessarily look like a solid color of, value of color. We're getting something that's more washy and like looks like maybe the water kind of had a natural way of sitting into the paper. And then same thing that I'm doing up here with the displacement of the edges based on the frame time. I actually don't know if I fully broke that down. So I'm taking the scene time node and then running the frame value into a snap node, which is being defined here by the warble step. That's basically controlling how many frames need to go by before we shift the W value of some of these noise textures. Then I'm dividing that by this divide value. I have it set pretty high because I don't want the W changing so extremely. I want it to have like almost a pretty like natural shift, like just a little bit shifting of the noise. And then after it's been divided by that extremely large value, we run it into the W value of this noise texture, which if I preview here, you can see is shifting around just a little bit based on that W value. But if we lower the intensity of that divide, you'll see that it becomes a pretty extreme noise shifting. And to me, this is a bit extreme. It looks pretty jarring seeing the noise shift around so intensely. So I like for the value to be a bit higher. This just feels like a much softer, more natural, like shifting, a little bit more evocative of like the grease pencil's noise modifier, the way you can like displace strokes. But yeah, that's the basic breakdown of how I got this watercolor effect and some of the ideas that went into building it. Just to give you a look at some of the other setups that I have this crayon template that I had to make a I'm still using that paper and cardboard, but I had to make this like tiled crayon asset. It's not perfect. It's definitely got some of these really sharp edges that could come through, but I think it works well enough to just give some displacement to the edges, which I can control here based on that really rough, like kind of crayon look. Similar to like some of Sunny Lim's work. You'll notice I'm not doing that linear light blending at the end, so the values that we're seeing are a bit more static, but I think it kind of lends itself more to like an oil pastel kind of medium. I really like oil pastels for that really bold, solid color look, and I think it comes through pretty strongly here, though maybe oil pastel would be a more apt name for this, but I definitely was like starting with the intention of getting like a crayon look, and I don't think it's so far off. But yeah, that's the basic idea with this. You can see the node tree here is rather different because we have this, rather than using procedural noise displacements, we're using this more organic crayon texture that I've constructed. I'm using a add value to kind of shift it a little bit more in the direction of the displacement that I want. By previewing the output, you can see we kind of control the base offset. Having it at about negative 0.22 was a good value for me. It was a little bit hard to wrangle because this image has so much higher contrast than like a regular noise texture. And then I'm doing the same thing where I'm controlling the intensity based on this color ramp. If I shift it, you can kind of see how it passes through the displacement mask. But you'll notice that it's definitely a lot noisier with this original output, and that's because once we come out here, we're using that Kuwahara node again. So this is pre-Kuwahara displacement, which has a lot more noise and grain and a bit of irregularity in some of the shapes. But by using that Kuwahara, we denoise it just a little bit to where it's still keeping like the larger displacements, but it softens some of the noisier spots in the illustration. And then finally, we have this like color burn. You know, you could use soft light here, but I kind of like the darker look of using color burn to mix in our paper texture. And then I'm also controlling the contrast of that paper texture with this color ramp node to get a bit more intensity of that paper texture here. One other template that I have packaged in here is this fuzzy colored pencil style. This was the first one that I was really trying to get. That definitely lended itself more to some of Milky Tea Studios and Plastiboo's illustrations, where they have the really nice kind of like fuzzy glow around their illustrations. I've kind of tuned it. I wouldn't say it necessarily looks so colored pencil-y here, but you could definitely get a bit closer to it by increasing the eccentricity a bit, reducing the scale of some of these displacements, maybe increasing the fuzziness here. I'd say in this example, you probably get the most satisfying variation based on the intensity of your Kuwahara node. Though I will say Kuwahara is probably like one of the heaviest shader processes that you could run in the compositor in Blender, especially when you let the size of the effect get up like into the 20s and 30s. I have a pretty powerful graphics card, and once I get up to like 40, that's when it starts to like I'm losing some FPS, especially as I increase the size of my viewport. But as far as like if you're running this on a laptop, I definitely recommend keeping this Kuwahara in a manageable range, maybe like 12 is about where I would say the max is, but you can still get a really nice effect even when you get to 12. One thing that I really like about this Kuwahara effect as it affects these like grease pencil objects, in traditional 3D and even in like film and television, when they're shooting stuff in camera, the depth of field does a lot to reduce the scale of detail on objects. If you blur something out kind of as it gets further away, like smaller in scale, it naturally has this way of like, you don't necessarily see the whites in a character's eyes anymore. Maybe you just see like the really dark iris of their eyeball once they get like a certain distance from the camera. And I really like that with this Kuwahara. It kind of has a similar effect where as we zoom out from this flower, we're not necessarily seeing the full like details anymore. It becomes this washy kind of blurred out color, and I think that lends itself really well to like larger natural illustrations. Of course, I just have this little like flower illustrated here, but it's something that I think is a really cool effect that's enabled by that Kuwahara node. If I reduce it, like we still get a really nice like fuzzy loss of detail from zooming out, but the Kuwahara just does so much to maintain like the rough shape of it while still like reducing the detail that you get in it. To show you guys some other files where I've been playing around with this effect, I think that Kuwahara like loss of detail is demonstrated really well with this scene where I kind of tried to make like a little self-portrait of myself. Very inspired by some of James Knoll's work here. You can see that as I zoom in, we get a lot of detail on the face. Like we can see the lines are really crisp and the details of the face are really clear. And then as I zoom out, it gets more fuzzed out. Even if I just like screenshot this and kind of zoom in here, you can see the fuzz is so apparent. Oh my gosh, how do you even move in this? If I zoom in, you can see like just how much detail is kind of like blurred together. And I think it gives a really satisfying look that takes even like a 3D illustration like this and starts to make it feel a lot more organic, feel like it has a lot more like hand touch to it. The thing I really love about this effect is it's not so concerned with like the form of the illustration or like trying to give it like a certain look as if like certain tools were used, but just a real focus on like the medium that traditional animation happens on, like giving it that look of like paper, the natural like ways that paper creates those deformations in like the silhouette of a character, or like the little details and like ways that color blends together, especially in like watercolor on paper, like that has the kind of paper that you might use in a particular illustration does so much to change the way that your tools behave on it. And I really think this kind of allows you to take like different textures, whether it's just a primitive noise texture or even like an actual image of like a paper texture. Like you could take any photo that you might take on your phone, and that's going to do so much to shift what this effect does to your illustration. Another little example here is these scenes that I made with that like crayon compositor effect. I wanted to animate some little bugs just walking around. This one admittedly is a pretty primitive little illustration, but I thought it was really evocative of like some of my like childhood storybooks I would have grew up with. I also have this little like leaf mantis inspired one. I think these ones with this crayon effect are especially satisfying to zoom in and out of, just see how much detail and kind of scale that it gives to the illustration. I also have this one. This one was definitely leaning more into some of my inspirations from artists like Plastaboo, but also Paper Beat Scissors. Here I was kind of playing around with opacity. So I was going in and illustrating with this sort of like light yellow green color, and then I lowered the strength a bit. And you can see that it kind of has this effect. Let me make sure I'm on the right frame. It kind of has this effect where if I layer the strokes, we get a bit more intensity, and then it's maybe more apparent and the more satisfying of an effect. If I zoom out a bit, you can see that the blending starts to look really nice, especially if you like really lower this value. So that was a really fun experiment playing around with this like mirror modifier in Grease Pencil. Not really any animation going on here, but the compositor does a lot to just shift around the grain a little bit to make it look a little bit more lively, even though it's just a static illustration. Now, this was another experiment in trying to take a 3D model and try to give it just a little bit of form and texture through the compositor. Now, I think my value mask might be doing a bit to kind of like prevent the larger parts of this illustration from getting the texture that I'm looking for. But if I kind of like tune that in, you can see we start to get more irregularity around the edges here, especially if I invert the effectiveness map. This is effectively at this point, I think it's kind of creating a mask specifically on just the middle values. But yeah, this is just like an actual little like 3D model that I've laid in here. But then when we turn on the compositor, you can see that it's doing a lot to like shift the form of it. And you know, if you were to pause on like any one of these frames, I wouldn't say that this is necessarily the most convincing effect. Like if I was trying to take like a 3D model and make people be like, oh yeah, that looks like a drawing. Like I wouldn't say this is the best example of it, but it was a fun experiment and just like giving a little 3D thing just a little bit of motion, you know, and trying to give it a little bit more of an unnatural like 3D look. One thing that I kind of take away with this experiment is that I think honestly, for what you gain from 3D and like the control of animating a character and being able to like use shape keys and things like that, with this kind of style, I really think you're going to get a lot more expressiveness out of just using grease pencil and organically like laying out the shapes in a more kind of like playful way. Because I think like 3D effectively it makes a pretty rigid character a lot of the time, and that can like work really well in certain mediums. Like I think it's why anime uses 3D so much for shows like Attack on Titan, because if you have this character that it's like not like the detail is important, like the sense of scale that you get with it is really important. And if you were to abstract that just for the sake of using hand-drawn everything, where you have to sacrifice a lot of pencil mileage if you want to keep all that detail, you know, a lot of shows, like one of my favorite shows, Ping Pong, the animation, a phenomenal like hand-drawn 2D animated anime, though they definitely have a lot of examples where they really like minimize the details of the characters for the sake of being able to have more fluid animation. Because if you want to have like a really expressive fluid animation that maintains all the detail, you're not necessarily going to get the best of both worlds. I think a lot of the time it even starts looking more janky, like the more detail you add. But by minimizing the detail and focusing on the motion, I think you get like really lively you know, expressive animation. And in the case of something like this, where it's like such a simple character, I think the 3D doesn't necessarily do it justice to like the expressiveness that I'm going for. Now, this experiment I had posted on my Instagram, you might have saw it there. Definitely just fully leaning into that original like fuzzy color pencil illustration kind of look that I was going for. But I think what's really satisfying in looking at this one is seeing the pre-composite versus what the compositor is doing. You know, if I even go into the material preview mode and just turn off the compositor, you can see this is what's getting passed into the compositor before it's finally getting fuzzed out. Like all these really scrappy loose lines become like, you know, fuzzed out at the scale that I'm rendering it at. And you can see even as I zoom out, you kind of get to a point that like you're kind of controlling the level of detail just based on the resolution of the render. You know, if I render it right now at 1080p, you see that we get to a point you can still see a bit of that detail of that line. And then if I were to increase the resolution to 1920, you can see this line is going to be a lot more visible by the time it's done compositing. Yeah, you can see we definitely see like a clear line, but even then it's like it's still like really fuzzed out to a point that it becomes like a really forgiving medium to animate really roughly in. And then just for fun, if I push it all the way down to 540 pixels, you can see that we have a extremely fuzzy little guy down here. And for my last little experiment here to share with you all is this 3D scene with these little like alien cat characters. I think this one is just a really great example of how the form of the characters kind of naturally gets obscured by this Kuwahara node as you zoom in and out. You know, we can see a lot of detail in the rendering and shading, but even at this point, I think the characters look really nice and soft. Like they start to look more like they could have been more like splotchily drawn in with paint rather than, you know, rendered 3D shaded characters. I definitely think it's a strength to this medium when you use like flat emission materials, but I think this one still looks pretty nice with the principled shaders kind of adding some shadows to the characters where we can control the lighting. The shader tree that I'm using on this little like beam that's shooting them down is also creating some fun like color artifacts. Another thing that I'm doing here, which you'll probably be able to see a bit, is I'm using a grease pencil line art modifier that is basically looking at the camera and generating some strokes based on the outlines of the 3D geometry. And you can see I can control the line radius. And I wouldn't necessarily say that this is my favorite effect to tack on to a scene like this, But I think as you lower the opacity and allow the Kuwahara to kind of just treat it like another layer of shading to be obscured, I think you can get some pretty nice little effects here. I definitely think you get a lot more out of adding the opacity, almost to kind of just create like barriers from one color to the next color. But yeah, there's a lot of fun things that you can do to play around with the effectiveness of this line art modifier on the grease pencil. It's a thing that I'm doing here much more visibly. You can see if I set camera to view and move my camera around, the line art is adjusting based on where the camera is. And for a character like this, I think he definitely looks a lot more like comic style. But I think, you know, another example, like the line art scale is not scaling with the distance, you know? And I think this is an example where you would definitely want to tune it based on how close you are to the character. So like if I just select my grease pencil object here, if I switch the thickness probably right about here, this would maybe be a more natural like line scale for being this close in. But you know, if I'm rendering my character from about this distance, I think it makes a bit more sense to use the line art at this scale. Another thing about the line art modifier is you can make the effectiveness based on collection. So this is only going to be rendering line art on the character collection that I set up here. So if I add a cube, it's not going to update based on this cube unless I move it into my character collection, which you can see now it's generating a little line. But this would maybe be a case where, you know, maybe you want to have different collections based on what is really close to the camera and what's really far away. Because at this point you get a regularity of the line art where this cube has this really thick line because it's really close to the camera covering up our character, but then the character has, you know, smaller lines. Another element about this scene that I think might be fun to talk about a little bit is using the grease pencil object to draw directly onto the surface of my character. So you can see I have surface selected up here with a really small offset just so the strokes aren't clipping into the geometry. If I increase the strength a bit and then maybe pick out like a nice, maybe like another yellow color. And then if I go in here, I can kind of just start drawing directly onto the geometry of my character. And in this style especially, it is very forgiving in, you know, kind of the effect you can get. I will say though, as you increase the thickness of your stroke, what you might see, like by the time that we zoom out, is that the stroke is actually going to clip off of the surface a bit, because every stroke you lay is basically like a dot in 3D space. Like if I just place this dot right here, you can see it's going to be a ball, like no matter what angle we look at it. So by using like a smaller scale, you can draw in like, you know, what is a circle on the side of a character's head, and it's not necessarily going to pop off the side. So that's just something to keep in mind there. It's definitely not as advisable either to use fill materials when drawing onto surfaces like this, because you'll see that the fill is just going to kind of like clip in. You know, you'll end up wanting to do a lot to kind of patch in the geometry. You basically kind of have to like mirror the topology of the mesh, which honestly, in this case, probably beats using like a regular stroke and trying to color in a shape like that. Like, I think even if you have to draw like a few shapes and kind of like segment them based on the topology, I think that looks a bit better. But yeah, I just wanted to do some yapping about these effects. I've had a lot of fun playing with them. I hope that it was clear enough, kind of like how I built the effects and kind of the thought process for how I set them up. If you end up downloading that file that I have on my Patreon, if you have any questions about it, be sure to leave it over on the Patreon, or we could discuss it over on my Discord that you'll get access to just for being in the Patreon. If you were trying to recreate this effect in your own file and something was maybe unclear in the way that I described the effect and how I built it, be sure to leave a comment. I'll do my best to get back to everybody and try to clear up anything that might have maybe been a little rushed on my behalf of trying to treat this like a tutorial. It maybe became more of just a yap session of me talking about like things I like about the effect and some of the ideas and applications that I've had with it. But thanks so much for watching. I hope you got some valuable info out of this little tutorial video thing. It's been a while since I made a Blender tutorial, but I think it's been one of the most gratifying things of my career online is just making little tutorials like this and then meeting people that have benefited from them and learned new skills and applied it in their own projects. Like, it's so fun getting to know that like the little bit of time that I spend in my room just playing around with this stuff could help inspire somebody to make something for themselves. Like, it's the coolest thing. So if you end up playing around with this effect and sharing it online, definitely tag me. I would love to see anything that you guys make. But yeah, that's about it. Thanks so much for watching. See you pals later.
All your stickers are going on their way.